Okay, good afternoon, everybody. This is Ben Tomczyk with Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget. Thanks so much for joining us this afternoon. As we get started, a few housekeeping items. As always, we are recording this and we are live streaming it on Facebook. We want to say thank you to everyone for joining. We're really excited to have you for what we think will be a very special webinar today. Over the last few months, many of you have joined us as we've continued to track and follow and analyze the fiscal and economic responses to the COVID-19 pandemic. That has included looking at some of the legislative proposals, what effect it may have on the debt. And we've even done one where we've just taken your questions for 45 minutes just to make sure that folks have the information they need. And we've been doing this as part of an initiative we have called COVID Money Tracker. And you've heard us talk about it, but this week on Monday, we actually launched a brand new tool to help track that response. And here to kind of help walk us through it is my colleague, Marc Goldwein. Before I turn it over to Marc, just a few housekeeping items. We hope to make this event as conversational as possible, so we encourage you to use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. We will be sending out a recording of this after the event. In addition to that, we hope that you will look at COVID Money Tracker, share it on social media, and I will also include a link to it in the chat box during Marc's presentation. Now I'd like to introduce my colleague, Marc Goldwein, Senior Vice President at the committee. Him and his team have really done great work with this, and we're so excited to share it, and I'm so excited to turn the conversation over to Marc. Marc?
Well, thank you. And I see someone in the Q&A saying they don't have audio. Since it seems to me the audio is working, it probably is something on your end. So you may want to check all your volume functions and make sure your speaker isn't attached to another app or something like that. Thank you all for being with us today. Ben, can you confirm for me that we see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Great. So I'm really excited because I've done a bunch of these webinars. And by the way, you might notice this is the first one where I actually have a reasonable length hair. I got a haircut on my front lawn. But for the last 5 months, we've been tracking every dollar spent by the Federal Reserve through administrative actions and through legislation. And we've been doing it to provide policymakers, the media, and the public as much information as possible about where this money is going. We know that given the current crisis, a lot of money needs to be spent very quickly. A lot of money needs to be allocated really quickly. And that money needs to be allocated in ways that, frankly, weren't the ways one would have designed them if we had more time. We know that this was such an emergency that we had to put the money out really fast. But that doesn't mean there shouldn't be accountability. In fact, it means it's even more important that we follow the money and make sure it's doing what is intended, or that we know when it isn't and know where it's going. So we've been tracking for a long time, and you've seen our analysis and you've heard my webinars. And you may have even dug into, what I call our dumb tables, our very long table of all the policies and legislation and how much has been dispersed. I'm really excited to announce today that we now officially have our state-of-the-art interactive COVID Money Tracker database. You can all view it yourselves if you go to covidmoneytracker.org. This isn't the final version. We're continuing to update with new numbers every week, with new features, feels like daily. But this is our new tracker. And it starts as the old one did, with the big picture. The big picture is essentially this. From a rescue perspective, the Federal Reserve has said it will inject up to $7 trillion of money into the economy in various ways, and $2.2 trillion is out the door. Meanwhile, through legislation, we've said we'll inject as much as $3.8 trillion into the economy. I say inject into the economy because I'm talking about all sorts of things here. I'm talking about spending programs, tax breaks, loans, loan guarantees, deferrals of various things. But of that 3.8 trillion, 2.3 trillion is now out the door, committed or dispersed. And then lastly, administrative action, things that don't require legislation from the president or other agencies, have obligated about 600 billion, of which 400 billion is out the door. 300 billion of that is delayed tax day, which has since passed and so is now back. So there's still about 100 billion outstanding, but 400 billion has been put into the economy. Now this is just our summary chart. It only gets better from here. And because there's a few minutes of loading and I want to let you all avoid that, I have some things preloaded for all of you. But this is our track the money visualization. And I'm going to shrink it a little bit so you can see it better. This shows all the money. Again, those same things, Fed, legislation, administration, but in a far greater level of detail. This is how much has been allowed. We could also look at deficit impact or amount committed. But then the cool thing about this tool is we can really dig deep. So we can go into administrative actions, and we know the president has actually committed about $400 billion from of tax deferral. That's 100 billion from delaying tax day. 300 billion from delaying tax day, and about 100 billion from delaying the payroll tax. We also know, if I dig into income support, that he's created this new initiative to temporarily increase unemployment benefits by $300 to $400, down from 600 before, through sort of a FEMA fund at the state level, as well as putting money towards student loan repayments. And again, you can kind of look at this whole thing. You can see we've given Medicare providers advanced payments in Medicare Part A. You can see down to each state where we've spent the money. And you can see this through all sorts of areas. This was administrative, but if I go back to the original chart, and maybe I want to look at how much is actually out the door, as opposed to how much has been obligated. And you'll see this is why I did load things in advance, because there's this this delay as it tries to collect the data, and it doesn't help that the internet in my house is horrible, so it goes even slower. But when this comes up, I'm going to show you more. Meanwhile, let me move on to some of the other cool features we can do. So there's search functions on the side. So for example, we can say, I want to only see money that's going to households. You know, I can look at money that's going to large businesses, small businesses, health providers, but I just want to look at households. And if I just look at the allowed money going to households, it turns out there's about 730 billion from legislation, about 310 from administrative actions going directly to households. And we can, again, dig deeper. Within legislation, almost half that money is these direct payments. It's cash payments made to individuals, basically as a form of tax rebates. Most of you probably got these. It's these $1,200 per person, $500 per child tax rebates. Right now, we have this distributed by when it was paid out. We are going to soon have it distributed by state as well, so you can see the states. But we could also, again, look at unemployment benefits. And we can see that unemployment benefits were actually expanded in a number of ways. There's that $600 increase, but we also expanded the number of weeks you can get benefits, who qualifies for benefits, and how long benefits can go for. And each of these have, you know, these combined to $334 billion that are allowed. And we can look again to see how much of that is actually out the door. Of that 330 billion that was allowed, 242 billion is out the door. Again, this tool was pretty powerful. This is going back to our committed and dispersed dollars. You can see, as we showed before, 2.3 trillion of legislative dollars are out the door, 2.2 trillion of Federal Reserve dollars. This is a lot of that is through loan programs. We could look, for example, at the economic injury development loans and see by state. We could look at the airline loans, and we can see by air carrier. And then for those that would prefer to get even more level of detail, we have an alternative to this visualization, an interactive table, which I'll unpack a little bit later. Going back to these search functions, as I mentioned, one way to search is by recipient type. Another way to search is by industry. So for example, here I've searched by health industry. And it turns out we've allocated about $260 billion just to the health industry. A very small amount of that, you almost can't see it, is loans given under the Federal Reserve. About 100 billion is advance payments to Medicare that's done through administrative action. But another 160 billion is from legislation. And that includes money to the health industry through the Paycheck Protection Program. These are forgivable loans. But then it also includes grants to healthcare providers and money for vaccines and treatment. And we can go down, and we have down to literally the firm level. We can tell you how much money has been committed to Moderna, for their possible vaccine? How much has been committed to Pfizer? Johnson & Johnson actually got 2 different grants, and we can see that. So this is really, again, very powerful to dig down to the detail. And we can go another level. So for example, we can look by state. This search is set up to look at Washington, D.C., Maryland, and Virginia, and to see the state and local aid that is going to these. One caveat, this does not include aid in the form of Medicaid payments. That's coming soon. But even excluding those Medicaid payments, we've dispersed or committed about $9 billion to the DMV area. The largest share of that is through the Coronavirus Relief Fund with $6 billion, which basically states can use for any new COVID-related expenses. But some share of that, about $500 million is education funding, including to Maryland and Virginia, and a very small amount actually to Washington, D.C. In addition, we have transit grants. So if you kind of go into the transit grants, and our tool shows where they're going. We have $500,000 going just to, we have about $1 billion going to the greater DC region, with about half of that going directly to DC and the other half split between Maryland and Virginia. Substantial amount of money going to Baltimore, but small amounts of money going to Virginia Beach and all the way down to Harrisonburg. Got $5 million for transit grants. And again, while this visualization, I think, is a really cool way to understand the data. If you're a researcher and you really want to dig down, your better tool is this table. And this table kind of can get you start very high levels. So we can just look at how much is going to the Federal Reserve, how much legislation, how much administration, but then we can dig down all the way to the firm level. So within the Federal Reserve, I could say, okay, the Federal Reserve has allowed $7 trillion, of which $2.2 trillion is out the door. How much of that is loan programs? 2.7. How much of that is going to the Main Street lending program? 600 billion allowed. By the way, only 226 million committed. And most of that, we don't yet know where it's going. But we do know that Mount Airy Casino got a $50 million loan, of which the Fed covered 47.6 million. We do know that Gulf South Energy Services got a $1.9 million loan. And we can cross-reference these against what kind of PPP loans they got. So Cherry Tree Gentle got $12 million of loans through the Federal Reserve, and they also got a loan of $1 to $2 million from the Paycheck Protection Program. We could also alternatively go all the way down to the college level, right? So we can look under legislation into grants. A big share of grants is education grants, going to higher ed institutions. The single biggest higher ed grant went to Arizona State University, which makes sense because it's a very large university. They got $64 million. Penn State got $55 million. Rutgers right behind at $54 million. I know there's a Rutgers-Penn State rivalry, so Penn State won, but just barely. And we can search by legislation. If we just want to see the CARES Act, we can see, by our estimates, the CARES Act will add about $1.9 trillion to the deficit. And it actually empowered the Federal Reserve to make about $2.6 trillion in loans. And so those are counted under the CARES Act as well. Or we can look by disbursement type. If I just want to see loans and forgivable loans, we can see that in total, if you add together administrative, Federal Reserve, and legislation, we're talking about $4.5 trillion almost of loans. But because these are loans and a lot of them get paid back, the total deficit impact is only about only about 700 million, significantly less than how much is going out the door. And by the way, only about $1 trillion of that has actually gone out the door. The Federal Reserve has been very slow to issue its loans, and I think is probably not intending to issue all of its loans. I really want to take time for questions, but I do want to show you some other cool features of this tool. You can search by entity. We don't have all the entities in this tool because it would be millions and millions. We have an additional Excel table for some of the smaller grants, and we are working on a second tool. And so side note, we would really appreciate your support as we build that second tool. But for larger grants, you can actually search by entity. So I can look at Delta, and I can see that Delta's actually gotten a few different types of support through the Air Carrier Worker Support Program, which is a program to help Delta keep its employees. They got 3.8 billion of grants and 1.6 of loans. Through additional loans to airlines, they got about 4.6 billion. And then, by the way, the Federal Reserve, through its corporate credit facility, bought about $5 million of Delta airline debt. I should just say as a side note, that's not money that Delta asked for, that last one. That's money that the Fed is sort of deciding unilaterally to buy bonds in order to strengthen the bond market. But nonetheless, Delta is benefiting from the Fed buying at the same time it's benefiting from these various other programs. Now, this is a lot of data to unpack. I encourage everyone to visit covidmoneytracker.org on their own. You know, you can find neat stuff in 5 or 10 minutes, but there's hours and hours worth of information. I encourage you to play with it. Meanwhile, we're not going to make you do all the work. CRFB is going to have ongoing analysis where every week or so, not only do we update the data, but we publish a new blog or a new analysis that digs in deeper into a piece of the data. You can see the analysis we've done so far. For example, we have something that compares the 2 most prominent pieces of legislation under negotiation for the next phase. But we're going to have lots of other stuff where we really dig deeper into this data, and we hope you continue to follow along. The last thing I'll say, since we are the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget, is we have to be cognizant of cost here. We are in the deepest economic crisis and public health crisis in anyone's lifetime. And this is exactly the moment that deficit spending makes sense. The reason that groups like ours advocate for low borrowing, for deficit reduction in good times, is so we have the capacity to borrow when we need, either when the economy is in a deep recession or when we have an emergency that we want to spread the cost over time. Right now, we're facing both. And so this borrowing, by and large, is reasonable and makes sense. But that doesn't mean it's free, and that doesn't mean it's costless. And so if you go back to our COVID money tracker and click this latest deficit projections tool, you can see exactly what this borrowing means. By our latest projections, the deficit will be $3.7 trillion. That's $1 trillion with a T this year. That's 4 times as much as it was last year. And even if there's no more rescue legislation, we'll be seeing deficits between $1.5 and $2 trillion a year for the rest of the decade. This is not sustainable. And while today's borrowing is absolutely reasonable for the current crisis, it paints a very clear picture of our long-term fiscal trajectory and our need to get our debt under control before it's too late. And I hope that as we move past this crisis, we get to the point that we can make serious efforts to both fund and control the cost of our largest trust fund and entitlement programs, make sure that we have adequate revenue coming into government, and right-size our spending so that we're spending on the things that we need. Because without doing some combination of those 3, we're never going to get our debt in a sustainable path. At this point, I would love to take questions, and I think Ben is going to moderate those.
Thanks so much, Mark. Again, if you have questions, we encourage you to use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. And if you want to play around with the tool while we're doing this webinar, just put the link in the chat box, covidmoneytracker.org. We encourage you to play around with it, follow it. And you'll notice at the bottom, if you find something you really like, you can share it on social media, via email, and we hope you'll do so. Mark, let me start with the first question we have from Ross, who says, what is the source of the spending data, and is the allowed amount the amount that has been obligated or amount appropriated?
These are great questions. So one thing I want to do is point you to this first blog called Welcome to the New COVID Money Tracker. You can also get to it if you go to our About tab. I apologize. If you go to our About tab and you go to Methodology, it gets you to the same place. So I can show you it again. And this answers a lot of these questions. Now, I'll answer yours, but if you look at this FAQ, this answers a lot of the questions about where the data is from and what it means. Now, in terms of what it means, we sort of have 5 ways that we categorize data. And, I'm remiss that I forgot to show you one cool thing with this chart, which is that you can click on any specific program. So I could click on the delay in the employment and get all the information about it. Okay, so let me give you an example of delaying tax day. So we have a few things that we track. We track the amount allowed, the amount committed, the amount recovered, and the net amount dispersed. And generally in the table, we show them as amount allowed, amount committed, or dispersed. And then we track the deficit impact. Amount allowed generally means how much is the maximum amount that can be spent on this program, or that can be allocated. Now, in many cases, this is very easy for us to decipher. It's basically how much was appropriated for the program, or what did the Federal Reserve say that its cap was on. The Federal Reserve says we will buy up to X amount. In some cases, our amount allowed is based on estimates. The Congressional Budget Office estimates that at peak, this will cost X. This tax deferral will cost Y. And so through a combination of, and in some cases, allowed is unlimited, in which case we sort of default to what's the maximum that ever has been spent. But that amount allowed is basically trying to say, what's the maximum that could possibly be spent in this program under current practices? Then we have amount committed. That's essentially the amounts that the government has identified the specific entity or person that's getting the money and has sort of started the process of getting them the money. So for example, if I was approved for a Paycheck protection loan for $1 million, that amount would be committed even before I got the cash, because the federal government has now said Marc Goldwein, Zoom webinar giving associates is getting $1 million loan. Amount dispersed is when the money actually goes out the door. The cash has actually followed. And then amount recovered tracks if any of the money is paid back, either because it's a loan and I'm paying interest, or I'm repaying the loan, or because it's a delay in tax season and now, people didn't pay taxes in April, but then they went ahead and paid them in July. And then net dispersal is the net of those. Now, if you look at our FAQ, you'll see that because we're looking at different kinds of programs, loans, grants, discretionary spending, mandatory spending, tax cuts, tax delays, and different entities, Federal Reserve, Treasury, et cetera, these categories mean slightly different things in each case. They have to. There's no perfect apples to apples. Our FAQ tries to explain what they mean where. I think, without getting too much into it, I think there's also a question about our data sources. I will just say there are many. Wherever possible, we use official government data about how much money has actually gone out the door. The Federal Reserve, the Small Business Administration, the Treasury Department all release stuff regularly. The Federal Reserve does as well. We supplement that with information from usaspending.gov, from daily Treasury statements, from weekly Federal Reserve balance sheet reports, from CBO estimates of what has and will happen. And then we supplement that with our own estimates and projections where solid data isn't available, or where we need to extrapolate. Maybe we got data for July 1st, and we need to figure out our best guess of what happened between July 1st and August 20th, because we're not getting our next data until August 30th.
Mark, I'm going to combine a few questions here. First off, Cara asks, are there any plans to be able to filter by congressional district? And then Douglas asks, kind of following up on that, who in Congress or the administration is aware of this tool, and what has the response been?
So right now you can filter by state, and it covers money other than the Medicaid money, which we're working on, which should be updated by tomorrow, that goes directly to the state government. And it covers money that goes to entities that we're tracking that are in the state. So for example, if I were to search by let me pull this out. If I were to search, this will take a minute. I'll tell you while I'm talking. In terms of next steps, we are working to build a lot greater state level data so that you can actually see not only money that's going to state and local aid, but also money that is going to PPP loans by state, to unemployment beneficiaries by state, for tax rebates by state, et cetera. So if I go to my advanced search here, for example, I can look at state and territory, and I can look at how much money is going to Florida, and to pick on them because I know that they have a lot of Fed loans that I'm about to show you. We're working on more robust state level data. So I can see within legislation, $6 billion has gone to Florida of what we're tracking. That's mostly state and local aid in a variety of forms, plus we have economic injury loans and money that's going to Florida Airlines, which turns out Spirit Air is based in Florida. I did not know that till now. And we're also track, for example, Federal Reserve money that's going to Florida. So in the corporate credit facility, we purchased Mosaic and Carrier Global and Fidelity and NextAir, which are all Florida companies. Within the Main Street Lending Program, there's a number of loans to Florida businesses, and Florida providers have gotten a lot of money. So we're building out the state level data to be more robust, to capture a lot more things over time. In terms of congressional district, we're working on a second tool that really is entity level, that will have all the Paycheck protection loans, which right now you have to download in Excel to see the detailed loans. But it'll have all the Paycheck protection loans and all sorts of other stuff. And for that, we are at least looking to do by zip code. We're going to try congressional district, but I don't want to make promises on congressional district. But we're going to try to narrow it down to as tight geographic areas as possible.
And Mark, can you tell people on the webinar how often we're updating this, what that process looks like?
Yeah, so I have a few members of my staff that haven't slept for basically 3 weeks building out this tool. It's a pretty intensive process to update this. People ask, well, doesn't this tool exist elsewhere? Can't you just get it from, USA Spending? Can't you just get it from this? Can't you just get it from that? You can't, because this tool is actually pulling in many, many different data sources because it's trying to simultaneously track the money spent by the Federal Reserve, the money allocated by the Treasury Department, by SBA, through the tax code, from administrative actions, and these are all over the place. And so it's an intensive process to gather this and to update it. In general, we will be updating this every Monday. We essentially start, if you want to kind of me to pull up the hood a little bit, we essentially start the update through the week. We track major changes. So if we hear about major loans or major differences through the week, we track it. And then starting Thursday night or Thursday early evening, we get the first data that allows us to really do update. And we spend all of Thursday evening and Friday updating everything, most from new data, some from estimates, so that every Monday morning, we will have new updates. Now, as things slow down, if the economy is looking more normal in 2022, we may switch to updating only every other week or every 3 weeks. But as of now, our intention is to update every week. And in some cases, we'll update more frequently when there are major changes.
Mark, we have a question from someone who writes, do you analyze what spending in the different relief packages is actually unrelated to either stemming costs incurred by the pandemic or tackling the crisis? So
far, we are counting all legislation that's related to the pandemic as COVID relief. But we are going to have this challenge coming up where I think increasingly over time, COVID money is going to be intermixed with, say, regular appropriations bills. And in that case, yes, we are going to pull it out, and we are going to exclude from this tracker money that is unrelated and include money that's related. We're going to try to do this to the extent possible without making value judgments. So if the legislators insist this is related to COVID, even if organizationally we're skeptical and we think this is just kind of a political gift, we are going to track that. But what we're not going to track is if policymakers are doing an ordinary tax extenders package or an ordinary appropriations bill coupled with COVID. We're not going to track that. But we are going to kind of give them the benefit of the doubt. Separately, through CRP's analysis, we are trying to call out what we think has really been an abuse of this crisis, where a lot of politicians are trying to use it as an excuse to pass things that are absolutely unrelated. There is no relationship between cutting capital gains rates and the current crisis. There's no relationship between getting rid of this SALT cap, which is basically a cap, basically a huge tax cut for rich people, or a $1 trillion infrastructure package, or for giving $10,000 per person to student loans. We can debate whether all these are good or bad policy, but these are not COVID policies, and they frankly don't belong on an emergency rescue bill.
Mark, we've had a few people ask if members of Congress have seen this tool yet. What has the response been? And, you know, now that we're kind of seeing the totality of everything we've done so far, we also have someone who writes in and says, where are the fiscal hawks? You know, you showed what the deficit is going to be. What do we do going forward?
So we just launched this week. We have shown to a number of members. A few we presented to earlier in this week personally. A lot have seen it through their staffs, and we've also been working with health staff. I think their reaction so far has been mainly, why can't we get this data? I think there's a lot of frustration in Congress that their oversight tools really aren't powerful enough to track everything at once. And it turns out this is a really major undertaking because, again, we're trying to track a lot of different types of spending. But there also seems to be broad agreement that whether we think the COVID spending was smart or whether we think we went too far or not nearly far enough, or whether we gave too big windfall to some or not enough to another, we should all agree that transparency and accountability is paramount here. And we should all be able to agree whether we like the Paycheck Protection Program or not, we should all agree that we should know where the money went. You know, whether we like the $600 of unemployment, extended unemployment benefits or not, we should all agree we should be able to see the money. And so I think there is broad support for more transparency.
Mark, we have a question.
And a welcomeness that our tools bring that. Go ahead.
Mark, we have a question from William who says, have you tracked how much an employer FICA has been deferred so far?
So we have an estimate. So unfortunately, because of the way that, this is really in the weeds, but because of the way that tax data is reported, the employer deferral of FICA, which basically means employers were allowed to delay their payment of Social Security taxes on the employer side. It actually counts as lower income tax revenue in many cases until the end of the year where they fix it. So we're not able to track it explicitly. We're not able to follow the dollars, but we are able to estimate it. And if you look at our legislation and you go into, this is just Florida, you don't only want to see Florida's, I presume. So if you go into legislation and you go to tax policy, you can see actually the top thing here is delay the employer payroll tax. And by our estimates, which are based on CBO and JCT, delaying the tax is going to delay about $350 billion of taxes. We think that so far, $161 billion of that has actually been delayed. The rest is still waiting. And ultimately, most of it will be paid back, so there will be something like a $12 billion loss. One little caveat I should give is that this does not include the delay to businesses who got PPP. Through later legislation, we said they could also delay their tax, and we're working on estimates for adding that piece in as well.
Steve writes, can you talk more about the Medicaid money we're tracking and how to find that on the tool?
Yes, absolutely. So the biggest increase in Medicaid came from the Families First Act. And so this is a good opportunity for me to show you filtering by legislation. So the Families First Act was the first large piece of coronavirus legislation. And it allocated, about $50 billion to states through increasing their Medicaid match. Now, it's increasing their Medicaid match, and so you might think that's health funding, but this was understood by everyone that this is essentially a way to get states more money, not to encourage them to increase their Medicaid spending, but to have the federal government pick up a bigger share. Now, by tomorrow, I believe, we will have data that shows this by state. Right now, we just have this one line that shows that there will be $50 billion out the door. There will be $50 spent on higher Medicaid matches. About $14 billion is out the door. Again, we intend to have this, and here's sort of the information. We intend to have this broken down by state by our next update.
Mark, we have a question from Sonette who writes, I briefly saw education funding. Is that intended to allocate funds to modify teaching methods, environments, and technologies to deal with the spread of COVID? If not, can you talk more about what we have in the tracker?
Sure. So I'm going to put two filters in. which will make us more powerful, and I'm going to do it within the table. Educational services, and as this loading, I will also do education providers. I'll try 2 places to see if we can get there faster. So far, the vast majority of the education money that has been allocated has essentially just been grant money to help states and localities, public and private, do what they were already doing. There's been some money for adaptation, but so far that has not been the bulk of what's been out the door. Sorry, I'm very impatient, and when I click it around, it actually makes it load more slowly. But I'll give you some example by just looking at this sort of unfiltered. This doesn't cover all the education funding, but a large share of the education funding is in 2 sources. Under these grant programs, there's about $14 billion that mainly goes to higher ed institutions. A little bit of that, $350 million, is for the types of improvements you're talking about, but the vast majority is literally just money to colleges. So money to Arizona State, or money to NYU, or money to Grand Canyon University. Meanwhile, we've given state and localities money for education, mainly to go to public schools. $13 billion for elementary and secondary schools. We can look down to California. California's gotten $1.6 billion. Of that, 1.5 is for localities, 150 million is for states, and 8 million is for administration. Again, some for innovation, 300 million, what you're talking about, but that is just a small minority. Most of the money we've given so far is not for the innovation, it's grants to help schools survive. And there's one other way that we've funded schools, which is through the Paycheck Protection Program, which we're all aware of. We think that's money, we think of Paycheck Protection money as money that's going to small businesses, but actually, if you look under the program, in the first tranche, about $7 billion went to education services, and the second tranche, a similar amount. We can go back to our filter, which is ready now. About $12 billion total went to education under the Paycheck Protection Program. This is money that mainly went to private schools and to charter schools, again, to help them fund their operations.
Mark, I'm going to do, I think this will be our final question for the afternoon. Do we have any sense of how much and through what mechanisms money has gone to help people, whether it's dealing with, rent, home mortgages? David writes, I fear a massive increase in homelessness and related economic strain.
So we have, I share your fear. Some good news, which you see in our analysis, is that so far, income is actually, on average, been up. So post the crisis, GDP, since the virus started, GDP is way down. Income is actually way up. And that's true not just for high income, in fact, more so for low income, for 2 reasons mainly. 3 reasons, but 2 main ones. One is the enhanced unemployment benefits, which have since temporarily expired and then been partially restored in some states. And so we may see that effect starting to fade. But then secondly, these economic rebate checks. And so far, overall income has been up, and that's good news. So then the Paycheck Protection Program and other things have helped. But A, that's not lasting. So we're already seeing in August, income has fallen back down some. And B, just because it's up on average doesn't mean it's up for everyone. And so there is a lot of individual hardship. There are a lot of people who have lost income. There are millions of people, tens of millions of people who have lost their jobs, or had their hours cut, or faced a lot of uncertainty. All this money, in some sense, is designed to go to people, designed to help the economy to go to people. We have a way to track money that specifically goes to households. So if you look at recipient type, we've sort of broken it down by education providers, federal agencies, financial sector, health providers, households, large businesses, pharmaceuticals, small businesses, state and local governments, and other. Now, obviously, a lot of money indirectly flows through to households, but we used our measure of households is kind of how much money is kind of pretty directly going to them. And so we looked at money going on unemployment benefits, which is about 240 billion so far. Nutrition funding about 10 billion. Student loans about 23 billion. We looked at money going to these rebate checks, tax relief for individuals, health spending that's going to individuals to help them fund their COVID costs, other things like housing support. And if you add all this up, we've committed about 730 billion through legislation, of which 550 is out the door. And we've allowed about 310 billion of individuals. This is mainly from delaying tax season, all of which is out the door. That's a substantial share of the total. But I think that what we're seeing is there's an interest from both parties in providing additional funding to individuals, both in the form of higher unemployment benefits and additional checks. And then there's debate of additional things like supporting people's healthcare or housing, additional money for essential workers. And I don't know when, if ever, politicians will agree to a new package, but if there is a new package, it's all but certain that it will include more aid for individuals and households.
Well, Mark, let me say, first off, congratulations to you and the entire team at the committee. This is an unbelievable resource. We encourage you to go check it out. You can go to covidmoneytracker.org. We'll send the link out in the webinar follow-up materials, and we hope you will share it on social media and with your family and friends. And Mark, since this is such a mammoth project, I'll give you the final word today.
Yeah, I want to recognize a few members of my team: Alex Holt, Mike Parkerson, and Tyler Evilsizer, who literally barely slept the last 3 weeks to make sure we got this tool up. And the rest of my team has had to work extra hard on everything else that CRFB is doing because of that. So just a big shout out to everyone that does policy work at CRFB, and actually everyone at the entire organization, because this has been a mammoth project. And thank you all for joining today.
Thank you so much, everybody, and we hope to see you on a future webinar. Have a great day. Bye-bye.